In 1936, the throne of Egypt passed to a boy not yet old enough to shave. King Farouk I, only 16 years old, inherited the crown following the death of his father, King Fuad I. The nation had high hopes for the young monarch. Farouk was handsome, well-dressed, and spoke with a polished air of Western education. Born into immense privilege on February 11, 1920, he had grown up surrounded by European tutors and had been sent to prestigious Royal Military Academy at Woolwich in England, a symbolic step intended to prepare him for leadership on a global stage. However, Farouk's stay in England was cut short when King Fuad died unexpectedly. Egypt was a nation struggling with identity and independence. Though nominally sovereign, it remained under significant British influence due to colonial-era treaties and ongoing strategic interests, especially over the Suez Canal. Egyptians longed for a ruler who could stand up to the British, represent Islamic values, and restore national pride. Farouk, with his youth and charisma, seemed the answer. Upon returning to Egypt to ascend the throne, Farouk was greeted like a celebrity. Massive crowds lined the streets of Cairo, chanting his name. His coronation inspired a wave of nationalistic pride. For a time, he represented the dreams of a new Egypt, young, modern, and independent. Even foreign observers were charmed. The British ambassador called him the most promising young monarch in the East. His early speeches were full of patriotic fervor and promises to uphold justice, improve the lives of his people, and defend Egypt's sovereignty. But from the very beginning, signs of trouble brewed beneath the surface. Farouk had been shielded from Egypt's internal political complexities. He was unfamiliar with the real-life conditions faced by his subjects. The transition from pampered prince to ruling monarch was abrupt and unforgiving. Though he had been trained in military drills and etiquette, he had little knowledge of governance or diplomacy. His court, inherited from his father, remained filled with older, self-serving politicians and sycophants who offered flattery but little counsel. As pressure mounted, Farouk began to retreat from affairs of state. He gradually surrounded himself with loyalists and courtiers who reinforced his worst impulses. These men didn't challenge his decisions or push for reform. Instead, they facilitated a life of indulgence and fantasy. Soon, Farouk's interest in royal duty waned, and he turned his attention to cars, watches, food, and women. This escape into luxury would become the defining pattern of his reign. Even during these early years, his public image was a study in contrast. On one hand, he toured rural towns and gave speeches about national unity. On the other, he was building a collection of imported cars, hosting banquets that lasted for hours, and dining off gold-plated silverware. This duality, between the idealized monarch and the pleasure-seeking young man, would come to haunt him as Egypt's political and economic crises deepened. One telling early scandal involved his extravagant spending on a personal train, equipped with a dining car that served multi-course French meals, and a bedroom lined with silk. All this while Egypt's economy was struggling with inflation, rural poverty, and rising unemployment. Yet for a while, the public remained forgiving. He was, after all, a teenager, one who had been thrust into immense power during a stormy time in Egypt's history. Many hoped that he would grow into his responsibilities. Unfortunately, instead of mature with experience, Farouk embraced the pomp and privilege of kingship while shirking its burdens. The realities of governance, parliamentary squabbles, foreign policy negotiations, and economic reform bored him. Over time, he became more isolated from people and more dependent on a shrinking inner circle. Farouk's relationship with Britain was also strained from the beginning. While he resented British control over Egypt's military and economy, he lacked the political skill or international backing to truly break away. His attempt at diplomacy often resulted in humiliation, and he developed a personal vendetta against British officials. At the same time, he failed to build strong alliances within his own military or government that might have empowered an independent Egypt. His reign became one of missed opportunities. As he entered his 20s, Farouk's obsession with personal pleasure began to dominate both his public and private life. The boy king who had once been greeted with hope and jubilation was on the path toward becoming a symbol of decadence, waste, and detachment. His tragic transformation had begun. The golden image of the young monarch would soon tarnish. And while Farouk still held the crown, it would not be long before the nation that once adored him would turn away in disillusionment. As the 1940s dawned, King Farouk I was no longer the boy monarch with a world of promise ahead of him. Instead, he had become the very image of excess. Egypt, racked by political instability and economic disparity, watched in frustration as their king withdrew into a private world of opulence, gluttony, and unchecked indulgence. For Farouk, the pleasures of the table, the thrill of material wealth, and the validation of being constantly surrounded by luxury were more captivating than any political responsibility. Farouk's love for food bordered on obsession. His meals were legendary, not just in size, but in extravagance. Breakfast often included multiple omelets, sausages, rich pastries, and Turkish coffee thick enough to coat a spoon. Lunch and dinner were even more excessive, sometimes running up to 20 courses. French chefs were hired to prepare elaborate European feasts, complete with foie gras, lobster thermidor, and flaming desserts. A single banquet could cost more than what an average Egyptian worker made in a year. By his mid-20s, Farouk's body was already showing the strain. He gained significant weight, with some reports suggesting he reached over 300 pounds. His royal robes had to be specially tailored, and aides whisper about the growing number of health concerns: high blood pressure, indigestion, and fatigue. But Farouk, ever defiant, dismissed any concerns. "A king should live like a king," he reportedly quipped. The king's appetite wasn't limited to food. He developed an insatiable craving for material possessions, particularly items of rarity and extravagance. His collection of luxury cars included Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, Ferraris, and rare Cadillacs, all imported at great expense. He was so obsessed with one vehicle, a specially designed convertible with gold trim, that he refused to drive it and instead had it displayed in his palace like a trophy. Then there was his obsession with timepieces. Farouk assembled one of the world's most impressive collections of watches, including ultra-rare pieces from Patek Philippe, Vacheron Constantin, and Rolex. He would sometimes change watches several times a day to suit his mood or outfit. He also possessed priceless collections of rare coins, stamps, and Faberge eggs, items few Egyptians had even heard of, let alone seen. His residences reflected this same sense of grandeur. The Abdeen Palace in Cairo was transformed into a display of European splendor, filled with baccarat crystal chandeliers, gilded ceilings, imported Italian marble, and French furniture. In Alexandria, his Montaza Palace became a seaside escape, where he lounged in silk robes, surrounded by concubines and courtiers, as jazz music played on gold-plated record players. All of this unfolded as Egypt's social and economic conditions deteriorated. The contrast was stark. While Farouk imported Belgian chocolates by the crate and built private movie theaters in his palaces, Cairo streets were filled with beggars and children without shoes. Farmers toiled in extreme poverty in the Nile Delta, and food prices continued to rise due to war and mismanagement. People began to question why they were tightening their belts while their king seemed to loosen his. Cartoonists and political satirists lampooned the king's gluttony. Newspapers, especially those with nationalist leanings, began to portray Farouk as a bloated, disinterested monarch, more concerned with collecting Swiss watches and addressing the rising discontent in his kingdom. These depictions struck a chord with the public, and Farouk's once golden image began to crack. To add to his reputation for extravagance, there were the legendary parties. At the height of his indulgence, Farouk hosted elaborate galas where food was served in gold leaf bowls, orchestras played through the night, and guests, both Egyptian and foreign, were treated to days of feasting, dancing, and indulgence. He even had a private yacht, Marusa, where he held floating banquets on the Mediterranean, sometimes with foreign actresses or aristocratic mistresses in tow. Some claim Farouk's extravagance was a form of escape. He had become a king without real control. His government was riddled with British influence, and his authority was increasingly symbolic. Caught between modern political forces and fading royal traditions, Farouk may have turned inward, finding solace in luxury when he could not find satisfaction in leadership. Others, more critical, argue that he was simply irresponsible and narcissistic, unwilling to face the burdens of his position and blinded by the pleasures it provided. What's undeniable is that by the mid-1940s, Farouk's appetite for excess had become a defining feature of his reign. The boy who had once promised a brighter future for Egypt had transformed into a monarch seemingly divorced from reality. The grand meals, the shiny watches, the opulent furniture. They were no longer signs of prosperity, but symptoms of decay. The royal court was starting to rot from the inside, and though the people still bowed before their king, many had begun to do so with clenched fists. The monarch's indulgence would soon give way to scandal, and then, eventually, to revolution. As King Farouk's appetite for food and riches expanded, so too did his lust for romantic conquest. While many monarchs in history have been known for their affairs, Farouk's womanizing reached almost mythical proportions. By the 1940s, he was no longer just the king of Egypt. He was also the self-proclaimed Casanova of the Middle East. Women, it seemed, became another of the king's many indulgences, collected, flaunted, and quickly discarded. From the beginning, Farouk's attitude toward women reflected a strange mix of traditionalism and modern decadence. Publicly, he played the role of a family man. In 1938, at just 18 years old, he married Safanaz Zulfikar, a well-educated aristocrat later renamed Queen Farida. Their wedding was the event of the decade, lavish, symbolic, and celebrated across the country. Egyptians rejoiced at the thought of their youthful king settling down and producing heirs to secure the future of the monarchy. For a brief time, the marriage seemed stable. Farida was elegant, poised, and beloved by the people. She appeared to soften Farouk's image, making him seem more grounded and responsible. Together, they had 3 daughters, Princesses Ferial, Fawzia, and Fadia. But behind the palace walls, the marriage quickly began to unravel. Farouk was not a faithful husband. He was known to host secret rendezvous in hidden palace chambers and at luxury villas on the Mediterranean coast. His partners ranged from Egyptian actresses and European socialites to exotic dancers and women of the court. Some encounters were fleeting, mere hours in length, while others evolved into scandalous, high-profile affairs. Cairo's elite whispered about the king's harem-like arrangements and his growing interest in Western nightlife. One of the greatest tensions in the royal marriage was Farouk's obsession with producing a male heir. He blamed Farida publicly and cruelly for not giving him a son, despite having 3 healthy daughters. The pressure mounted as palace astrologers, doctors, and even religious scholars were consulted for solutions. The blame placed on Farida was not only deeply unfair, but also humiliating. In 1948, after a decade of strained union, Farouk divorced her. The queen, once adored by the nation, left the palace quietly, her dignity intact but her heart wounded. Farouk's response to the divorce was predictable. He simply found another woman. In 1951, he married Nariman Sadak, a 17-year-old commoner from a middle-class family, in what was framed as a Cinderella story from modern Egypt. The public was captivated by the young beauty, and Farouk basked in the renewed attention. Nariman became known as the last queen of Egypt, and for a time, it seemed that this fresh start might rehabilitate Farouk's image. Soon after, she gave birth to a son, Prince Ahmed Fuad. The long-desired male heir had finally arrived, and Farouk celebrated with fireworks and feasts. Yet, even fatherhood could not restrain his desires. While Nariman adjusted to life under constant scrutiny and immense pressure, Farouk continued his nocturnal adventures. He disappeared for nights on end, returning with lipstick on his collar and new perfume lingering on his robes. Rumors spread of women flown in from Italy, of private cabarets held in underground chambers, and Farouk's increasingly erratic behavior around his lovers. The king's womanizing was not just personal scandal, it was political vulnerability. Foreign dignitaries and spies frequently gained access to the palace through courtesans, and compromising photos and stories began leaking to the press. British intelligence, always wary of Farouk's unpredictability, monitored his affairs closely. At one point, a scandal involving a belly dancer with supposed connections to nationalist movements almost erupted into a diplomatic crisis. Egyptian society was also undergoing change. The old deference to royal whims was eroding. Feminist voices were beginning to emerge, challenging patriarchal norms and questioning the king's morality. For many Egyptians, Farouk's indulgence in women was not just immoral, it was insulting. While their daughters struggled for education and freedom, The king paraded mistresses through royal halls. To maintain his image, Farouk employed palace staff to manage his romantic escapades. They arranged meetings, paid off angry fathers and brothers, and silenced gossip with bribes. But as the number of affairs increased, so did the difficulty in covering them up. He once allegedly seduced the wife of one of his own ministers, a move so brazen that it sparked a near resignation from the entire cabinet. By the early 1950s, Farouk was no longer viewed as a ruler, but as a playboy in a crown. He embodied everything his nation was beginning to hate: indulgence, hypocrisy, and detachment from reality. His relationships became fodder for comedians, columnists, and critics alike. The once handsome boy king had become a bloated tabloid figure, more famous for his exploits in the bedroom than the throne room. In his palaces, Farouk still played the king, but in the eyes of the people, he was becoming a parody of one. The man who was once Egypt's most eligible bachelor was now its most public embarrassment, and the cracks in his kingdom were widening fast. As Farouk's indulgences in food, women, and wealth escalated, so did his peculiar and deeply troubling hobby, one that shocked foreign dignitaries, embarrassed his court, and baffled psychologists. King Farouk, ruler of Egypt and custodian of centuries-old pharaonic heritage, was a kleptomaniac. The irony was grotesque. A man who lived in unimaginable luxury, with treasury at his disposal and palaces full of priceless artifacts, simply could not resist the temptation to steal. The tales of his thefts became palace legends, and increasingly diplomatic headaches. One of the most infamous stories involves a state visit with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill during World War II. According to multiple accounts, Farouk was so enchanted by Churchill's gold pocket watch that he swiped it during a private meeting. When the theft was discovered, Churchill, who was not known for his patience, made his displeasure clear. Embarrassed aides scrambled to recover the watch, and though it was eventually found, Farouk never apologized. He simply smiled, as if it were a joke too clever to explain. This wasn't an isolated incident. There were reports of him pocketing an antique snuff box from a French ambassador, lifting a ceremonial sword from an Ottoman exhibit during a visit to Turkey, and even stealing a ruby-studded ring from a foreign princess during a gala. Some of these events occurred so blatantly that his own security detail began to dread international visits. Wherever the king went, so too did the fear of diplomatic scandal. At home, the behavior was no less disturbing. Farouk was known to walk to the royal museums at night, flashlight in hand, choosing artifacts to borrow for his personal quarters. When curators protested that many items were irreplaceable, he would simply dismiss them. "What's mine is mine," he once said, "and what's yours is mine too." But Farouk didn't just steal from foreign dignitaries or museums. He stole from his own people. Stories circulated of him taking valuable heirlooms from aristocratic families under the pretense of preservation. These families would receive official notices saying their historical possessions were being acquired for royal safekeeping. In reality, many of those pieces were never seen again. They vanished into the labyrinthine halls of his palaces, or ended up in private auctions in Europe, funneled through secret channels operated by palace insiders. Even in his personal interactions, the thefts continued. Guests would often find jewelry missing after visiting one of his banquets. One Italian opera singer accused the king of stealing her diamond brooch after she refused his advances. When asked about the incident, palace officials laughed it off as a misunderstanding, but the singer never recovered her brooch, and she never returned to Cairo. The psychological reasons for Farouk's kleptomania have long fascinated historians and analysts. Was it a symptom of deep insecurity, a desperate need to assert power by taking things that didn't belong to him? Or was it a twisted form of thrill-seeking, a way to spice up a life already saturated with luxury? Some believe it was a subconscious rebellion against the gilded cage of royalty. He could have anything he wanted, but he wanted what was forbidden, what wasn't offered freely. His compulsive stealing was treated as a dark joke in Cairo's elite circles. Jokes like "lock up your cufflinks," "the king is coming" became common at diplomatic parties. The British, who already regarded Farouk as a liability, began using his habits as justification for their increasing surveillance of the palace. Secret reports sent to London described the king as morally unfit and dangerously unpredictable. British and American diplomats, aware of his kleptomania, began preparing duplicate props during visits, fake gifts and replicas to prevent the loss of real valuables. Farouk's kleptomania wasn't limited to physical items. It extended to people's lives, dignity, and rights. He took what he wanted, when he wanted, often with no regard for the consequences. And the people of Egypt were beginning to take notice. What had once been whispered behind closed doors was now being discussed in coffee houses and printed in satirical columns. The king who dined on gold plates and seduced actresses was now also the king who stole watches, paintings, and memories. This behavior further eroded the image of monarchy in Egypt. In a country struggling with poverty, political frustration, and colonial interference, Farouk's crimes, no matter how petty, felt like betrayal. Egyptians were tired of being ruled by a man who viewed the nation as a personal toy chest. The royal thief, it seemed, was stealing more than trinkets. He was robbing Egypt of its dignity. By the early 1940s, as Europe burned under the fires of World War II, Egypt became a crucial theater of geopolitical maneuvering. The Suez Canal, vital for the British Empire, made Egypt a strategic linchpin, with German Field Marshal Owen Rommel's forces pushing into North Africa and British troops entrenched in Cairo and Alexandria. The country was teetering on the edge of crisis. In the middle of this chaos stood King Farouk, a monarch whose personal life had spiraled into scandal and whose political instincts would now be put to the test. Farouk's court, already rife with corruption, suddenly found itself under a magnifying glass. The allies were watching closely. The king's apparent indifference to wartime struggles was one concern, but far more alarming were his alleged sympathies for the Axis powers. While Egypt was technically aligned with the Allies, Farouk's personal behavior and political decisions raised suspicions in London, Washington, and even within his own cabinet. Rumors swirled that Farouk admired the fascist regimes of Europe. He openly criticized British presence in Egypt, which, though understandable from a nationalist perspective, became problematic when coupled with secret meetings and coded messages. It was said that Farouk maintained contact with Italian and German diplomats, even after official diplomatic relations had been severed. MI6 operatives operating in Cairo noted strange late-night visits to embassies and intercepted communications suggesting Farouk was offering passive support, or at the very least, turning a blind eye to Axis agents operating within Egypt's borders. One particularly damning event occurred in 1942. The British, growing increasingly frustrated with Farouk's resistance to their demands, especially regarding the appointment of a pro-Allied prime minister, decided to act. In a move that stunned the world, British tanks surrounded the Abdeen Palace in Cairo. British Ambassador Sir Miles Lampson confronted the king directly, delivering an ultimatum: appoint the British-approved candidate Mustafa El-Nahas or be deposed. Farouk, humiliated and terrified, caved. He signed the decree and retained his throne, but the damage was irreversible. Egyptians now saw their king not only as corrupt and decadent, but also weak and incapable of defending national dignity. Photographs of the palace under siege by foreign tanks became symbolic of everything wrong with Egypt's royal leadership. In retaliation, or perhaps an embarrassment, Farouk's behavior became increasingly erratic. He began lashing out at both foreign powers and his own ministers. He replaced experienced advisors with yes-men and doubled down on his indulgent lifestyle, as to bury his political impotence under layers of gold, silk, and scandal. Meanwhile, his personal security became paranoid and overbearing. He suspected betrayal at every corner and began secretly recording palace conversations and monitoring the phones of his own family members. The royal court transformed into a hotbed of espionage. The British, the Americans, the Germans, and even the Soviets had agents operating in Cairo, many of whom focused directly on Farouk. His lovers, his chefs, even his barbers were potential informants. Secret documents from the time reveal just how seriously the Allies took the threat of his unpredictable loyalty. One MI6 report labeled him an unstable and dangerously vain man who prefers the company of gamblers and dancers to statesmen or generals. These fears were not unfounded. During this period, Farouk began entertaining increasingly strange guests. Italian courtesans, German-educated businessmen, and former aristocrats from Eastern Europe, all with unknown motives, mingled in his lavish parties. One guest at a 1943 masquerade ball later turned out to be a known Nazi sympathizer, raising alarms in Allied intelligence circles. The king's strange obsession with astrology and occultism also emerged during this time. He reportedly employed personal mystics to guide his political decisions and forecast Egypt's future. One of his trusted clairvoyants advised him not to trust the British, a warning Farouk took far more seriously than any official intelligence briefing. This dependence on pseudoscience over strategy highlighted his growing detachment from reality. All the while, the Egyptian people suffered. Food shortages became common. Inflation soared. Black market goods replaced store shelves. Soldiers returning from the North African front complained of neglect and poor leadership. Veterans felt betrayed, having fought under a flag rule by a monarch more concerned with seduction and superstition than survival and sacrifice. The war years should have been a moment for Egypt to assert itself on the global stage, to emerge as a leader among the Arab nations. Instead, the country stagnated under a king increasingly viewed as a liability. While the Allies eventually triumphed in North Africa, King Farouk's image did not recover. He may have survived the British tanks at his gates, but in the hearts of his people, the crown had already begun to rust. The monarch who once promised strength and pride had become a symbol of scandal, submission, and squandered potential. And as the world moved toward a post-war order, Egypt's patience with its Playboy king was rapidly wearing thin. By the late 1940s, Egypt was a nation on the brink. The Second World War had ended, but the wounds it left were deep and unhealed. British troops still occupied key strategic areas, notably around the Suez Canal, and the Egyptian economy struggled to recover. Meanwhile, King Farouk, instead of rising to meet the moment, sank deeper into excess, scandal, and detachment. The monarch, who once stood as a youthful symbol of national pride, had now become a cautionary tale, one that played out in public. To the growing anger of his people, the decline wasn't sudden. It came in stages, each marked by missteps, humiliations, and growing public resentment. One of the most damaging events was Egypt's involvement in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Farouk, eager to portray himself as protector of Arab and Islamic interests, committed Egyptian forces to the conflict alongside other Arab nations. The goal, to prevent the establishment of the State of Israel and protect the Palestinian territories. But the reality on the ground was far more complex. The Egyptian military, plagued by corruption, poor leadership, and inadequate supplies, was woefully unprepared. Farouk, who had long neglected serious military planning in favor of personal pleasure, now faced the consequences of years of mismanagement. Soldiers were sent into battle with insufficient weapons and rations. Medical supplies were scarce. Communications broke down. The result was a humiliating defeat at the hands of a newly formed Israeli state. The loss shattered public confidence in Farouk. For many Egyptians, it was a final betrayal. Young men returned home maimed, shell-shocked, and embittered. Mothers wept in silence, blaming the king not just for the loss of their sons, but for the shame that Egypt now carried on the world stage. Protesters filled the streets, demanding answers. In cafes, markets, and mosques, the people whispered a once unthinkable question aloud. Should the monarchy continue? This moment of national crisis exposed the rotting infrastructure of Farouk's regime. Corruption ran rampant. Positions in the military and government were bought and sold like trinkets. Taxes enriched the elite, while ordinary citizens went hungry. Landowners and cronies of the palace profited from wartime contracts. Meanwhile, Farouk continued to host lavish dinners, collecting rare watches and seducing young actresses as if Egypt's defeat were someone else's problem. The king, increasingly paranoid, began to tighten his grip. He dismissed advisors who questioned him, surrounding himself only with loyalists and flatterers. He ordered the surveillance of suspected dissenters and began cracking down on press freedoms. Newspapers that had once tiptoed around his behavior now published scathing critiques, only to be shut down or censored. But even this crackdown could not silence the roar of discontent. In 1946, a young military officer named Gamal Abdel Nasser began organizing secret cells of disillusioned army men, many of whom had fought in the 1948 war and returned disillusioned with the monarchy. These officers, calling themselves the Free Officers Movement, believed that Egypt needed radical reform, free from both colonial influence and royal corruption. They quietly recruited like-minded individuals throughout the armed forces, forming a network that would one day change the course of Egyptian history. As whispers of conspiracy swirled, Farouk remained oblivious. He spent more time abroad, vacationing in Italy, gambling in Monte Carlo, and entertaining mistresses in Paris, than governing his own country. His absence created a power vacuum, one quickly filled by opportunists, nationalist radicals, and discontented soldiers. Even Farouk's inner circle began to fracture. Former allies turned cold. Ministers resigned under pressure or fled abroad. Intelligence agents warned him repeatedly about growing unrest within the military, but the king dismissed them. He still believed he was untouchable, that the throne, gilded with divine and historical legitimacy, would protect him. But the truth was far more dangerous. The throne had become a gilded cage, and the people were rattling its bars. The final years of Farouk's rule were marked by desperation. He staged poorly executed reforms, promising new parliamentary elections and minor changes to land ownership laws. But few took him seriously. To many Egyptians, it was too little, too late. The king's image was beyond redemption. And then came the moment that sealed his fate, the fire of Cairo. On January 26, 1952, in response to a violent confrontation between British forces and Egyptian police in the city of Ismailia, angry mobs erupted in Cairo. Rioters burned British businesses, movie theaters, nightclubs, and even foreign embassies. The city fell into chaos. But while fires blazed across the capital, Farouk hosted a private birthday party for a European socialite at the Abdeen Palace. News of his revelry during one of Egypt's darkest nights enraged the public. Farouk, once again, had chosen pleasure over duty. That night, the smoke that filled Cairo's skies was more than fire. It was a signal. The people were done waiting. Farouk's downfall had begun, and there was no turning back. By mid-1952, Egypt was a nation barely held together. Its people were seething. The monarchy, once revered, had become a bloated symbol of everything Egypt wanted to cast off: decadence, corruption, incompetence. The British still maintained military control over the Suez Canal. Nationalist movements were swelling in the streets, and Cairo had yet to recover from the devastating riots earlier that year. Amidst this atmosphere of crisis, a group of young, determined men prepared to strike the final blow to the kingdom of King Farouk. These men were not politicians or diplomats. They were military officers, patriotic, battle-hardened, and angry. The Free Officers Movement, led by Lieutenant Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser and fronted publicly by General Mohammed Naguib, had been operating in secret since the late 1940s. They were a coalition of army officers, many of whom had fought in the humiliating 1948 war with Israel and returned with a bitter realization: Egypt needed a revolution. The Free Officers saw the monarchy as the root of Egypt's stagnation. They blamed Farouk for political paralysis, economic ruin, and national humiliation. While the king threw lavish dinners and flirted with foreign actresses, his soldiers bled in the desert with outdated rifles and empty stomachs. The time for petitions and protests had passed. Now the officers believed it was time for action. Their plan was bold, calculated, and efficient. Operation Revolution was set into motion on July 23, 1952. While Cairo slept, tanks rolled out of military bases under cover of night. Key bridges, radio stations, and government buildings were occupied without resistance. Farouk's elite Republican Guard, bloated and complacent, was caught completely off guard. By dawn, the city was effectively under control of the military. At the Abdeen Palace, panic spread quickly. Farouk, initially in disbelief, was roused from his sleep by aides who informed him that the army was no longer under his command. The streets of Cairo were lined with tanks, not to protect the monarchy, but to dismantle it. Rumors spread that General Naguib had declared a new government, one that would strip the king of all political power. Farouk's first instinct was to resist. He summoned loyal officers and demanded a military response, but it was too late. The army was gone. Even those who had once pledged allegiance to the crown refused to act. Some generals outright ignored his calls. The royal yacht Al-Marusa, anchored in Alexandria, was made ready for an emergency escape. For the first time in his reign, Farouk saw clearly that he was alone. But what surprised everyone, even the free officers, was Farouk's reaction. Rather than flee or fight, the king chose a different path: surrender. Whether it was fear, fatigue, or a sudden flicker of grace, he agreed to abdicate. On July 26, 1952, just 3 days after the coup, Farouk boarded the Marusa, flanked by a small group of loyal attendants and his family, including his infant son, Ahmed Fuad II, the last crown prince of Egypt. He left behind a letter of abdication, naming the baby prince as a successor. It was a symbolic gesture. The monarchy, in reality, was over. The free officers allowed Farouk to leave with dignity, granting him safe passage into exile. They even allowed him to carry a portion of his wealth, including several suitcases of gold and precious objects. Nasser later explained this mercy by saying, "We did not want to make a martyr of him. Let the people see what becomes of a king who forgets his country." As the Marusa set sail from Alexandria's harbor, thousands of Egyptians gathered along the shore, not to mourn, but to watch. Some waved, some laughed. A few wept, unsure what the future held. Farouk stood on deck, silent, dressed in full naval regalia, a final echo of royal theater in a republic that no longer had use for kings. According to legend, Farouk turned to one of his aides and muttered, "Soon there will be only 5 kings left, the kings of spades, hearts, clubs, diamonds, and England." It was a bitter joke, but a telling one. Farouk knew he was witnessing the end, not just of his rule, but of an era. The monarchies of the Arab world were crumbling, and Egypt's revolution had lit a fire that would spread far beyond its borders. The news of the abdication spread quickly. Egyptians awoke to a new reality, one in which the royal family no longer ruled and the military held the reins of power. For many, it was a moment of hope. For others, uncertainty. But one thing was certain: Farouk's Egypt was no more. The revolution had succeeded, bloodlessly, almost miraculously. And though it would be years before the free officer transitioned into a formal government, the monarchy's fall marked the beginning of modern Egyptian history. When King Farouk stepped aboard the royal yacht Al Marusa on July 26, 1952, he was no longer a king. He was a relic. Behind him, Egypt had turned a page. Ahead of him lay a life stripped of power, purpose, and privilege. For the first time in his life, Farouk was no longer in command. And while he left Egypt with a promise of dignity, the exile that followed was anything but graceful. Farouk's first destination was Italy, a country that had long been a playground for the Mediterranean elite. There, in the picturesque seaside town of Capri and later in Rome, he tried to rebuild the fantasy world he had lost. He checked into the most luxurious hotels, dined at the finest restaurants, and reassembled a modest circle of loyalists and hangers-on. Though his title was gone, he still insisted on being addressed as His Majesty. Old habits, it seemed, died hard, but while he was no longer a king, Farouk remained wealthy, at least for a time. He had managed to smuggle out a significant amount of gold, cash, and valuables aboard Al Marusa. Some say he left with over 200 suitcases, including priceless watches, coins, and jewelry. For years, these treasures allowed him to live in something resembling his old style, gambling in Monte Carlo, vacationing along the Riviera, and hosting lavish dinners with foreign socialites and exile royals. Yet exile wore him down. The grandeur faded. The suitcases emptied. And as the years passed, so did Farouk's relevance. In Egypt, his name was slowly erased from public memory. Streets once named after him were changed. His portraits were taken down. The new regime under Gamal Abdel Nasser vilified him as an embodiment of decadence and foreign corruption. To the revolutionary generation, Farouk was a cautionary tale, not a monarch to be mourned. Farouk, however, clung to the illusion of return. He spoke often of Egypt as if he were still king, speculating that the new republic would collapse and beg for his guidance. In letters to close friends, he insisted he was merely on vacation and that the people would one day see their mistake. But the world had moved on. Egypt, despite internal struggles, embraced its post-monarchical identity with vigor. Nasser's nationalism reshaped the country, and Farouk became a symbol of a discredited past. His personal life in exile also unraveled. His second wife, Nariman Sadik, the last queen of Egypt, left him in 1954, taking their son, Ahmed Fuad, with her. Tired of his infidelities, mood swings, and declining health, she returned to Cairo and never spoke publicly of him again. Farouk, once the most eligible bachelor in the Arab world, was now a lonely man who chased memories instead of women. The former king continued to gain weight, ballooning to over 300 pounds. His health deteriorated rapidly. High blood pressure, diabetes, and heart disease took their toll. Still, he refused to change. He spent his days eating lavish meals, drinking heavily, and wandering the streets of Rome at night, often dressed in a tuxedo, hoping someone would recognize him. Occasionally, he would give interviews to Western reporters, offering commentary on Middle Eastern politics, always with a tone of bitterness and sarcasm. They traded a king for a colonel, he once said, referring to Nasser. Let's see how long it takes for them to regret it. But if he hoped for sympathy or vindication, he received little. The world was now obsessed with decolonization, liberation movements, and new nations. Farouk's Egypt, plagued by foreign control and royal excess, was part of a history most people wanted to forget. In truth, Farouk never adapted to being a commoner. He still dined with a golden fork and wore tailored suits that strained at the buttons. He traveled with bodyguards long after he had no subjects to fear. He remained, at his core, a man out of time, born into monarchy, raised in excess, and unable to survive without them. But perhaps the most tragic element of his exile was how utterly meaningless it became. There was no grand return, no royal restoration. Just a man growing old and irrelevant in a foreign land, try to hold on to a title that no longer meant anything. Farouk, once the most powerful man in Egypt, ended his days wandering European boulevards, bloated, alone, and often mocked. And yet, even in disgrace, he remained strangely compelling. To some, he was a fool. To others, a victim of circumstance. But to Egypt, he was a mirror, reflecting both the glory and the rot of monarchy that had outlived its time. The exiled king would not live long enough to see what his homeland would become. But in the final twist of fate, his story would end not in war, trial, or imprisonment, but in the most mundane and mysterious of ways, a dinner he would never finish. On the night of March 18th, 1965, King Farouk of Egypt sat down for what would be the last dinner of his life. The former monarch, bloated, embittered, and long since forgotten by the world that once bowed before him, had chosen his favorite Roman restaurant, Illinois Deauville, in the heart of the Italian capital. As usual, he ordered extravagantly: oysters, lobster thermidor, roasted duck, piles of pastries, and a bottle of vintage wine. Farouk ate like a man trying to reclaim something he had lost. Not just food, but power, pleasure, and relevance. He was dining with a young Italian woman, described as his latest companion. By now, Farouk was well into his mid-40s, though his frame suggested a man older and more battered by excess. His cheeks sagged. His fingers were swollen. His once charismatic eyes were dull and yellowed with age. But as he sat in the soft glow of the restaurant's chandeliers, cutting into a rich dessert, Farouk was, at least at that moment, still playing the role of royalty. Then, suddenly, he slumped forward. A gurgled gasp escaped his lips. His face turned red, then blue. The silver spoon dropped from his fingers. Patrons at nearby tables looked on in confusion before the room erupted in panic. His dinner companion screamed. Waiters rushed to his side. Someone shouted for a doctor, but it was too late. Within minutes, King Farouk I of Egypt was dead, face down in a plate of creme caramel. He was 45 years old. The official cause of death was listed as a massive heart attack, unsurprising given his extreme weight, unhealthy habits, and long-standing medical issues. But whispers began almost immediately. Had he been poisoned? Was this the quiet revenge of political enemies, years in the making? Or perhaps the vengeance of a foreign intelligence service silencing a man who knew too many secrets from his time as a monarch in a volatile region? There was no autopsy. The Italian authorities, perhaps out of respect or convenience, quickly certified the death as natural, but conspiracy theories flourished. Some claimed Farouk had recently expressed interest in returning to Middle Eastern politics, possibly trying to stir dissent against Nasser from afar. Others believed he still held sensitive documents from his time as king, evidence that could embarrass or endanger both Arab and European governments. But no proof ever emerged, and the mystery of his final moments only deepened his legend. Back in Egypt, the response was muted. The state-controlled press reported his death with restrained indifference. There was no national mourning, no parade, no official statement of sorrow. Farouk, once the face of the nation, had become little more than a footnote in a new Egypt, one that had outgrown its royal past and was now racing toward nationalism, socialism, and pan-Arab unity under Nasser. And yet, some Egyptians, especially older generations, could not help but feel a pang of nostalgia. They remembered the boy king in his white uniform, waving from palace balconies, filled with potential. They remembered the grandeur of royal ceremonies, the shimmering lights of Cairo before the revolution, the fantasy of monarchy, even if that fantasy was hollow. In cafes and tea houses, people whispered, "Did you hear? The king has died." Some said it with bitterness, others with sadness. Farouk's body was prepared for burial in Rome, but the issue of where he should be laid to rest stirred quiet debate. Initially, it was assumed he would be buried in Italy, the land of his exile. But after discreet negotiations between the Egyptian government and members of the former royal family, permission was granted for his body to return home. It was a gesture of closure, not honor. He was buried in Al-Rifai Mosque in Cairo, ironically, in the same complex as other deposed royals, including members of the Muhammad Ali dynasty. There were no grand speeches, no gun salutes, just a small ceremony, attended by a few loyalist relatives and curious onlookers. The once omnipotent king of Egypt was lowered into the earth with quiet finality. In the end, King Farouk died as he lived, surrounded by luxury, haunted by excess, and consumed by appetites he could never fully satisfy. His story didn't end with a revolution or a trial, but with a quiet, almost tragic collapse over an extravagant meal. It was poetic, in a dark way. The man who gorged himself on the riches of Egypt was undone not by a coup or a bullet, but by his own unrelenting hunger. A man who had once ruled a kingdom died not with thunder, but with a whisper over dessert. When King Farouk was laid to rest in Cairo's Al-Rifai Mosque, few could have imagined that decades later, Egypt would still be debating his legacy. To some, he was a symbol of rot and ruin, an overfed monarch who gorged on the spoils of a suffering nation. To others, he was a tragic figure, a flawed man swept away by the changing tides of history. But one thing remains undeniable. Farouk's reign and his fall marked the end of an era. Farouk had ascended the throne as a teenager, seen by many as a fresh start after the tired, sickly rule of his father, Fuad I. He was charismatic, handsome, and symbolized a modern Egypt. But the young king was never equipped to lead. Raised in palaces, surrounded by sycophants and sent to elite European schools, Farouk grew up sheltered, entitled, and dangerously naive. The trappings of monarchy insulated him from the struggles of his people, and by the time he began to grasp the realities of rule, it was already too late. His reign would be defined not by statecraft or diplomacy, but by headlines about stolen pocket watches, mistresses, gambling sprees, and grotesque overindulgence. For many Egyptians, the image of Farouk, bloated and swaggering through Monte Carlo casinos in his exile, became the enduring symbol of everything the monarchy had become, a dynasty too concerned with its own pleasure to govern with wisdom or justice. Yet to dismiss Farouk entirely as a caricature would be to overlook the complexity of his time. His Egypt was a land caught between worlds. Tradition and modernity, colonial domination and independence, monarchy and republicanism. British soldiers still patrolled Egyptian soil. Foreigners owned large chunks of its economy. Nationalism was rising, and so was the voice of the common people. In this powder keg, Farouk's greatest failure wasn't necessarily what he did, but what he didn't do. He failed to evolve. Where leaders elsewhere modernized their nations, reformed institutions, and answered the cries of their people, Farouk retreated into a fantasy world of velvet and gold. He surrounded himself with sycophants and shielded himself from criticism. While Egypt's young intellectuals demanded reform, he silenced their newspapers. While the military demanded resources, he hoarded wealth. In his final years on the throne, he was not ruling. He was simply existing, detached and delusional, in palaces growing colder by the year. Still, time has a curious way of softening even the sharpest historical judgments. In recent decades, Farouk has undergone a minor reevaluation in some circles. Books, documentaries, and even social media posts have revisited his life with a more nuanced lens. They acknowledge his failures, but also point to the complex environment he inherited, a semi-independent Egypt dominated by European powers, with deep inequalities and a bureaucracy riddled with colonial influence. Some argue that Farouk was more puppet than puppeteer. Others note that he did try, in fits and starts, to assert Egyptian sovereignty and resist foreign manipulation. He was, at times, fiercely proud of his country, but pride without vision is rarely enough. And so, Farouk became a cautionary tale, a reminder that a crown cannot compensate for leadership, and that charm is not a substitute for character. Perhaps the most enduring symbol of his reign is his exile, not just physically, but emotionally. Farouk never truly belonged, neither to the people he ruled nor to the European elite he emulated. He was an outsider in his own country and a curiosity abroad, a monarch without a throne, a man without a country. Today, when Egyptians walk past Al Rifai Mosque, most do not stop to think of the man buried there. There are no statues, no state holidays, no official commemorations of King Farouk. His name is rarely spoken in classrooms, and yet, in subtle ways, his shadow still lingers. His fall paved way for a new Egypt, revolutionary, republican, and nationalist. The free officers, led by Nasser, built their legitimacy on the ruins of Farouk's excess. But history is not just about victors. It's also about the defeated. And in Farouk's story, there are lessons that transcend time, about power, privilege, and the perils of disconnecting from the people one is meant to serve. In the end, Farouk's legacy is a paradox. He was a king without control, a ruler without reform, and a man who devoured all life had to offer but died empty. His story is not just Egypt's. It is a universal tragedy of hubris, indulgence, and the collapse that always follows when rulers forget that power is not a right, but a responsibility. And so, Farouk remains, enshrined not in marble, but in memory, a monarch who could have been great, but chose instead to be grand. What happens when a king chooses pleasure over duty? How Farouk's final meal said everything about his downfall. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. What do you think was Farouk's greatest mistake?